of Ruth. I've been spending a fair amount of time reading the book of Ruth, believe it or not, and I think it's an extremely relevant book for reasons that you may not think it is, or maybe not think that I'm thinking about, but because it is one of those portions of Scripture from the Hebrew Scriptures that we're told that was given for our learning, that we might, through patience and understanding of the Scriptures, find hope. And also what's going on in the book of Ruth are things that are written that they're examples for us, that we wouldn't do what they did and what they're doing. And in some cases, there's some accounts here that would be good examples for us to follow suit with. And I'm not going to read the whole book, but I will refer to quite a bit of it. If we start out in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days of the judges, that the judges ruled, that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." Well, when you look at that, you say, well, that's very interesting. What was going on in the time of the judges?
Chaos.
And that wasn't a very good time in the history of Israel, really. And so when we start out with the fact that at the time of the judges, a lot of things were going on. In chapter 1, in verse 28, we find just one thought that describes a lot of situations. But it came to pass that when Israel was strong, that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out. Well, the children of Israel were supposed to drive the Canaanites out. They were supposed to drive all the people in the land out, and they didn't. And since they didn't drive them out, the text tells us that they were a snare to them. And the Lord said in chapter 2 and verses 3, "Because you didn't drive them out, I won't drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods will be a snare to you." So anything that's going on in the book of Judges is during a period of time when the nation Israel has not obeyed God, which was not unusual. And it was at a time when they had allowed those who worship pagan gods and goddesses in the land to remain there for one reason or another. And God says, okay, they're going to be a snare to you. And then also in the 2nd chapter, by the time we get to the 13th verse, it says, "They served Baal and the Ashtoreth." And these are God's people, the people that God had chosen through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the people that he brought out of the land of Egypt. These are the people that had seen his ability to protect them, to defend them, to survive all kinds of physical things that could have taken them out as a nation. And certainly the attitude of Pharaoh afterwards, as he had second thoughts, if God had allowed, could have taken them out. But he hadn't. And they're the nation that said that all that God tells us to do, we'll do. But they didn't. And among other things, they were told when they went into the land not to mingle with them, not to give their children in marriage to them, the people in the land, because they would lead them away from God. But they did. And there's a lot of similarity to that and where we live. Because we live in a time when God tells Christians, believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may know what is a good and acceptable and perfect will of God. But what are most professing Christians really doing with their life? In my opinion, a high percentage of them, they don't even know that that's what God wants them to do. And so we're led around by this or that or other fad where the standards of morality for most people, the standards of what's acceptable conduct between unmarried people, between married people that are not married to each other, what constitutes marriage, male, male, female, female, male, female. We live in a world where so many people, so many professing Christians will say, well, things are different now. Well, they may be different than they were at some point in time to some degree in a positive way, but more than likely they're different in a negative degree, in a negative way. And so it's very similar to the time in which they were in. There's a phrase in the first part of the book of Judges that says in chapter 17, verse 6, chapter 19, verse 1, chapter 21, and verse 25, there was no king in Israel. It is in the first two is the first thought, but in the third, that introduction isn't there, but this is the thought. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So then you say, okay, so what does that mean? Well, let me start with what probably is as much of an illustration to me of the departure of the nation Israel at that point in time from God's instruction to them. There was a guy by the name of Micah in Judges 18 and verse 4 who hired his own priest. He hired a Levite actually, but he was his own priest. Well, that's not God's program. And God had from the descendants of Aaron, there were priests, they were Levites, there were people that had duties and responsibilities around the tabernacle, and God had given the instruction for that. But that didn't seem to fit what Micah's thought was at that particular period of time, so he hired his own. And then when we get to the 19th chapter, we have really a sad story of a certain Levite who took a woman as a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And then the woman left him and was unfaithful, played the harlot, is what we're told, to him. Went back to her father's house in Bethlehem of Judah. And so he goes to get her back after, I think it was 4 months. And he spoke kindly to her, and she agreed to come back. And he spent some time visiting with her father, and they had a good time, and he wanted to go, and then his father talked to him to stay in, and I think his father did that twice, and finally the third time he said, no, I got to go, and he went, but he didn't leave very early in the day. And so when he gets to you have a city called Jebus, that is Jerusalem in parentheses it says, he decided he would spend the night there. And so he's on the street in the town, and an old man comes to him and says, why don't you come to my house? You don't want to spend the night here on the street. And I gather from the text that he really didn't think it was safe. And I also gather from the rest of the story that it wasn't safe. But because apparently this man knew that the city was pretty much given over to sexual immorality of probably all kinds, and it wasn't safe for a man and his concubine to be on the streets of that city at night. So the Levite goes into the man's house, and he eats, and they were drinking after dinner, and then the people of the city, the men of the city, men of Belial, it says in some contexts, that and in the New King James it says perverted men, and the Old King James says sons of Belial, which I think that's the devil, and their desire was to sexually assault this man, and probably or possibly his concubine. And I think most of us are familiar with the story, but that's Judges 19, and verse 22 and beyond. And so the man, and I've never been able to understand this, and I still can't, offered to these men that wanted to take this Levite and rape him, molest him, and his concubine evidently, and the man of the house offers his daughter and the concubine. And I don't understand that. I can't understand that. But remember, what I'm trying to do is outline the fact this is not a good time for Israel. This is not a good time. And the net result was they apparently took the concubine. There's no more mention of the man's daughter, so I don't know what happened there. And they molested her, raped her, and along about daybreak they either turned her loose and she got back, or they took her back to the door of the man's house. And when the Levi got up in the morning to leave, he went to the door and she was laying there on the doorstep. And he called to her and she didn't respond, and he realized she was dead. And he picked her up, put her on his mule, and went home. And that's really, really sad. It indicates a terrible, to me, even on the part of both of those men that would do that, it seems to me like something's wrong with their standard of values or their, but, so the Levite gets home and he takes his concubine and cuts her up into 12 pieces. And he sends one of the 12 pieces to each of the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And he said, and describes what took place. And they rallied together to say, what are we going to do? This is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And so they made a commitment between themselves, a vow that they would judge those people that did that they also, in the process of the thing, made a vow that they would not give any of their daughters to be wives to the men of that tribe of Benjamin. But when they went to get them, the tribe of Benjamin protected them. And they wouldn't allow them to be judged and punished. And so the men of Israel and the soldiers of the tribe of Benjamin are at war with each other. And the tribe of Benjamin had 26,000 swordsmen and 700 left-handed men that could sling a stone and hit a hare and not at a hare and not miss it. They were really tough guys. And Israel had 400,000 men that were prepared to fight, and they did fight, and they lost the first day. And Benjamin killed 22,000 of the men of Israel, protecting these immoral men of Belial, perverted men. And the second day, the men of Israel asked God, and God said, yeah, go against them. And they killed, as I read it, an additional 18,000 men. And then Israel fasted and wept, and again they asked the Lord, what should we do? Phinehas stood before the Ark of the Covenant and prayed, and the Lord said, go up, I'll deliver them to you tomorrow. Now, why the Lord? It's interesting that you can come up with all kinds of, you can come up with a lot of whys. I can anyway. And you can come up with a lot of theory as to why, but it's all theory, and I don't know. But the Lord, I know, did allow Benjamin to defeat the men of Israel. Benjamin, whose purpose was contrary to God's will, and that is to protect vile men who were guilty of death under God's law, to protect them. And yet God gave them victory on 2 days, allowed them to have victory on 2 days. And then when he finally tells Israel, okay, you go, I'll give them to you, if nothing else, I would believe it would be for the purpose of Israel to understand, even whatever the odds are, if you win, it's going to be because I gave you the battle. You didn't win on the basis of your own strength. So then Israel did defeat the Benjamites, and it was a pretty terrible slaughter, and I think it was 600 men that got away and hid of the tribe of Benjamin. So they pretty well reduced Benjamin to nothing. Then they had another problem. That is that they'd all sworn that they would never give their daughters to marry any men of the tribe of Benjamin. So in essence, the tribe of Benjamin would stop. It would be all over. There would be no more Benjamites. And it's interesting that later on there's reference, I come from the smallest tribe of the tribe of Benjamin. They were the smallest tribe because of that, as I understand it. So the men of Israel said, okay, what are we going to do? Because we don't want to have a tribe wiped out. And so they said, well, let's see, because the decree was that everybody was to report, to fight this sin in their midst. And they found out that that the men of Jabesh Gilead, they hadn't shown up. So they said, okay, let's go wipe them out, and we'll take their virgin daughters and we'll provide them as wives for the men that survived in Benjamin. And so they get 400 that way. They're still short 200. So how are we going to get wives for the other 200 men? And so the bottom line is they kidnapped them. And they gave them to the men. And then when they were approached by the fathers of those women, they made an appeal on the basis of the fact that we had 200 men that were, and because of our vow, we couldn't give daughters to them from our families to marry, and we don't want a tribe in Israel to be snuffed out. So, bottom line, would you let this one slide? And they did. Point being, again, this is not a place to be. This is not where you want to live. Things aren't going well. You know, sometimes we look at the world in which we live in. If you look at the whole world, in my opinion, you have to, if you're thinking soberly, you just come away and say, you know what, things are not really getting better. And then if you come down and look at our own culture in the United States, to me, if you're thinking along the lines of what does the Scripture teach, you again have to conclude, you know, things are not getting better. It's getting worse and worse and worse. It's not a good place to be, if you want to look at it that way. And yet, as is always true, and if you go through the Scriptures, there have been other times in the history of mankind that things really got bad. In Noah's day, things were really bad. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. It wasn't a good place to be. When Israel went into Babylonian captivity, it wasn't a good place to be, but there were people that found grace in the eyes of the Lord. There were people that were able to please the Lord. As we sing of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they wouldn't bow, they wouldn't bend, they wouldn't burn, because God watched over them, and though they were thrown into the fiery furnace heated 7 times hotter than it was normally heated, they didn't burn because God watched over them. And Daniel in the lion's den, God watched over him. But those men didn't live in really a good time in Israel. And so, and the same is true in the time of the judges. It was a time when they followed a cycle. And they would, because, as we started out, they hadn't destroyed the nations that God told them to destroy. And God says they're going to be a thorn in your side. And they were a thorn in their side. And so they would follow a cycle. First, they'd be tempted to worship the Baal and the Ashtaroth, the pagan gods and goddesses. And then God would punish them. And they would go into some kind of distress or captivity. And then they would cry out to God for mercy. And God would bring them back and forgive them. And they would be successful again. and they would be there for a little while, and they would turn around and do the same thing again. And they did that over and over and over. And so in that time frame and in that environment, there's some people that we're going to talk about, look at, think about. There's a guy by the name of Elimelech. Elimelech is a husband and a father in this story. He's an Ephraite of Bethlehem, Judah. And he moved out of Israel in a time of famine, a drought, because it was obviously a time when God was judging them. And he moved to the land of Moab. He had a wife named Naomi. And Naomi, as you look it up, the word is a name that, and she'll reference it later on in the story, but is pleasant. She was, I don't know whether she was pleasant or not, but that's what her name was. She was a wife, became a mother, became a mother-in-law, became a widow in the story. And then there's a couple of guys, Mahlon and Chilion, and I always thought it was interesting. They died apparently pretty young, and they were husbands, they were the sons of Elimelech and Naomi, and they married women and became husbands but not fathers, and they died. So the three men in that family died. Elimelech and Naomi, Mahlon and Chilion, and Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion died. Now then, their wives were Orpah and Ruth. And they become widows. And so now they're not in their land. I mean, in Naomi's land, they're in their land, the land of Moab, but they're in Orpah and Ruth's land, but they're not in Naomi's land. And Naomi hears that the famine is over and that things are prospering again. And so she's wanting to go back to Bethlehem, Judah. And she does. She starts back. And again, not to read all the story, but as she starts back, her two daughter-in-laws are going with her. There's Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, and they're headed for the land of Judah. And then, I don't know how far they went, before Naomi has a conversation with her daughters-in-law, and she tells them, go back to their people. Don't go with me. I've got nothing for you, really. I'm broke. Whatever land that was hers because of her birthright and her marriage and all, somebody else was using it, and she says, I got nothing to offer you, really. But she tells them, and this is another one of those things that are in this story that I don't understand. She tells them, go back to your people and to your gods. Little g. I just happened to notice on my notes it's big G, but it's really little g. Your gods. Your gods. Why? Why would one who knew Jehovah God, the Creator, the one that had made a promise to her father Abraham, confirmed to Isaac and Jacob and the 12, why would she send her daughters-in-law back to their gods? I don't understand that. And yet, probably there are times in the lives of many people, maybe professing Christians, maybe real Christians, that have accepted the Lord as their Savior, but at a given time, they're not walking with Him, and they would encourage somebody to go back to something that was not of God, whatever it might be. And Naomi tells them, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. She knew that they needed to marry. They needed to remarry and would want to remarry. They were not mothers. They hadn't borne any children. Most young ladies would like to do that. And they were not old enough. She considered that she was too old to get married, but they weren't, and she didn't consider them to be that. And it's interesting to me that at first both of them said, it's in verse 9 of chapter 1, that surely we will return with you to your people. I don't know why they said that. You know, I don't know why from the standpoint of Orpah. I think I know why from the standpoint of Ruth, but I don't know whether she just thought, well, that's the thing to do, or I should be loyal. We should be loyal to our mother-in-law. She's lost her husband. She's lost her sons. Let's not let her travel back alone. I don't know what Orpah was thinking about. I know where Ruth was because of what the account says later on. But and then in chapter 2 and verse 11, Naomi says, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me?" And again, I wonder, she had apparently lost her vision. She was discouraged. She was probably felt beat. She did feel, because as she went, when she gets there, where she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. For I went out plentiful, and God is bringing me back." In essence, destroyed. But and so now she has to convince them, and so she says, "Look, are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown?" Well, that's pretty unlikely, probably. Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? In other words, and I think one of the things that I see in this is that on one hand, Naomi is looking at this in a very practical way. On the other hand, from a spiritual standpoint, she's lost her vision. She lost her vision. She says, "You wouldn't wait. You wouldn't restrain yourself." She said, "It grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Well, I don't know whether that's true or not, because I don't know enough about her personally. But I do know that what was going on oftentimes in Israel during that period of time is people were suffering because the nation was being judged. And the individual may not personally have been so much responsible for what was going down. They weren't the leader. It's like when we look to the future, and Joel speaks of the time in the day of the Lord when God comes back. He says the priests are going to stand between the porch and the altar, and they'll tear their hearts and not their garments, and they'll cry out to God for mercy. It was the leadership that had to speak on the behalf of the nation. And that's what God was looking for. So I don't know whether it was against her personally or not, but she felt that way anyway, obviously. But she's recognizing two facts in life, and they are always true. I think they're always true. I would qualify it by saying maybe they're not always true for some people, but I think for the most part they are true. In Genesis 2 and verse 18 we read, God said, "It's not good that a man should live alone." I didn't say that. God said that. And that's the reason we have women. God said that. It's not good for a man to live alone. And in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, and the fact is that God created woman for the purpose of functioning in a relationship with a man as a helper fitting, or a helpmeet, as the old King James says it, for that person. Being designed that way, they're gonna be most comfortable that way, and more successful that way, and feel more fulfilled in most cases that way. But in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, after the fall, God says to the woman, your desire shall be for your husband. And that's pretty true. In the case of, again, most women, now you can look at some things that happen in the lives of some people and you say, well, that's not true. And then in that case, well, it could be. Maybe a woman has been mistreated as a child. I believe we have to realize that there are birth defects and things that happen that we recognize as physical birth defects, deformities. There could be some, I would submit that there could be some that affect the way we think. But that's really the exception by far, not the rule. The other thing is that those two thoughts, it's not good that man be alone, and your desire shall be for a husband, are reinforced by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, when he says, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. That's the way it's supposed to work. And then in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 14, the Apostle Paul tells Timothy, therefore I desire that younger women marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. In other words, live godly, moral lives. So, you know, it's true that Ruth is recognizing, okay, you guys need a husband. You guys are going to want a husband. I can't help you. Now, what she didn't do is go a step further and say, but I serve a God that can look after you and can look after me, and really has looked after me to this point. She was still alive and breathing and healthy and able to walk the distance, whatever it was, back to Bethlehem, Judea. And so, you know, I don't know what the future brings, but let's go back to my people and to my land and to my God, and let's see what happens. She doesn't have that outlook at that point, and that's too bad. So when we go back after she gets through with her pitch, you know, like, go on back. Yeah, I don't have anybody that could be your husband. If I were to have a thought or prospect or a husband or have a husband tonight and bear children, sons, you wouldn't wait for them to grow up. Probably at least 18 years. 16 anyway. And, you know, you wouldn't do that. So go on back. Go back to your people and to your gods, and may God watch over you some way. I don't know how she put that all together, but when we're not thinking straight, we're not thinking straight. You know? And so in verse 14 of chapter 1, we read, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and went back to her people, and as far as I know, to her gods. I don't know otherwise. But Ruth wasn't going. That verse says, but Ruth clung to Naomi. No, I'm not going. I'm not going. And then in verse 15 begins a statement from Ruth, chapter 1, verse 15. Well, 15 is Naomi, really. 16 is where Ruth picks it up. But Naomi says to Ruth when she clung to her, says, no. She said, your sister-in-law, verse 15, has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Come on. And then Ruth says in verse 16, which is really a very popular and oft-quoted passage, sometimes quoted in weddings when it really isn't stated in a wedding, or is it stated about someone that has any anticipation of marriage. But it is a statement that should be true in marriage. So Naomi says, Ruth says, verse 16, entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Your God. To me, that's the most important one. Your God, my God. And I'm sorry that, at least as I understand the account, Naomi doesn't have the same conviction that that's a good thing. That's the only right way. That's the only way to go. That what we as a nation, Israel, have are the oracles of God. It's the truth of God. It's the truth about God. It's the truth about what pleases God. It's the truth about God's love for us. It's the truth about God's promise to provide a seed that would bless all nations. She apparently at this point in her life didn't have that confidence. But again, Ruth says, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. And there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you from me. That's a pretty strong commitment. And it's pretty much all the way around. In other words, I'm committed to look after you and to be with you, and I'm going to worship and serve your God, and your people are my people, and I'm going to die where you die, and the only thing that's going to separate from me from you is death. That's a pretty strong commitment. And it's a beautiful commitment in light of the fact that I believe it's predicated on the fact that she had come to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel. So they go on to Bethlehem, and as they come to Bethlehem, the city sees who it is as they're coming to the city, and this is Naomi. She left with Elimelech. They left because there was a famine. They've been gone a long time. In the time they've been gone, the sons have grown, the sons have married, the sons have died, their fathers died. I don't know whether they knew all this or any of it, or not at that point, because they just greeted her. Wow, here's Naomi. And then in verse 20, Naomi speaks again. Sometimes I think Naomi's like a lot of people. Sometimes if we didn't speak, we'd be better off than if we do. But she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Well, she could still be pleasant. If she didn't have anything else to be thankful for, what would it be that she could be thankful for? If she didn't have anything else, what would it be? Am I the only one that thinks?
She was alive.
Okay, and she was alive, but aside from the fact that she's alive.
For God. Relationship with God.
Okay, a relationship with God, but apparently she didn't value that too much at that point.
How about Ruth?
There you go. That's what I'm thinking. If she didn't have,
Loyalty.
I won't take the lid off of that one right now.
Wow.
If she didn't have anything else to be thankful for, it was the commitment of her daughter-in-law to her and to her people and to her God. But at this point, apparently that doesn't rise to that level in her mind. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. I think as we go through life, it's really important that we don't do what she's doing, unless we deserve it, anything like that. Because we're told, in the world you shall suffer tribulation. But be of good cheer, the Lord said, for I've overcome the world. We're told that in the last days perilous times shall come. That means things are not always going to go well. We're told that it is appointed that the man wants to die, and nobody dies of good health. This is the reason you die. Some way, something takes your good health away from you. Something. So So just because things are not going well doesn't necessarily mean that the Almighty has testified against me. That isn't necessarily so at all. And as I say, to the contrary, in the absence of, is the way to say it maybe, in the absence of some evidence of something that you know you're guilty of, I believe it's inappropriate to assume that God did this to me. God's afflicting me. God took this away. Did God cause the flood on the nation of Israel? I'm not the flood. The famine and the drought on the nation of Israel that caused Elimelech and Naomi to have to leave, and feel that they had to leave at least in the first place. No. There's some question in my mind as to whether they should have left or not, but that's another point. I don't know that that's established that that's what the issue was. But anyway, she comes back. Now it does seem that she's able to rally as the story goes on, but as she comes back to town, she's not a very pleasant person. She's a negative person. And I would assume consistent with what she said to her daughters-in-law, consistent with what she said to those who greeted her as Naomi, she probably was a negative person to be around. And we don't need to be that way. She didn't need to be that way, but we can be that way. We can be that. If we focus on all the things that are going wrong and don't focus on the things that are going right, if we focus on the things we've lost and don't look forward to the things that we can receive, that's why the Apostle Paul tells us that the suffering of this present time is nothing to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. Because there's going to be suffering in the world in which we live. Just like there was suffering for everybody that was a part of the nation of Israel at this time, from time to time, periodically. And so the 22nd verse of the first chapter tells us that they arrive in Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. At the beginning of barley harvest. Okay. And then Boaz comes on the scene. That's the last character that comes on the scene. Boaz is a relative of Naomi's deceased husband. He's a man of great wealth. And he has fields that have barley in them. And he has people that are harvesting barley. And he probably, like all the rest of the farmers in that area, was probably harvesting barley. And so when they get there, remember, they don't really have much. They've left their land and they've left their nation and they've gone to the land of Moab, and I assume that Naomi did it as much as anything under her husband's direction, so it was really his decision, probably. And so they go back. They're just a couple of poor people that have come back, pretty much probably destitute. So God has made provision in Israel for people that are destitute. And I won't take the time to read it, but in the Mosaic Law, there's provisions for when you harvest, don't harvest the corners of your field. If you're harvesting, and I don't know how big the corner was, but in today where you have big pieces of equipment, combines that harvest fields, where the corner would be pretty big, because they can't go too close to the corner maybe anyway, unless they were to make a cut at it and really try to get in the corner. But they were to leave the corners unharvested, and if in the process of harvesting, which would happen, grains fell off, sheaves fell, maybe, whatever fell off, they were not to go back and glean the field. The gleanings were left for the poor. The corners were left for the poor. And so Ruth, not being lazy, and recognizes that they need something to eat, says to her mother-in-law, I think I better go glean in the field. And so she did. She at first asked her mother, please let please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him whose sight I may find favor. I think it's interesting she asked her mother-in-law. I don't know whether that was just out of respect for her or love for her. I'm inclined to think I would have said, or Ceci would say, I'm going to go glean in the field today. But it says that she asked her, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him whose sight I may find favor. And I'm going to read that as indicating something about her character and personality. And her mother said, go, my daughter. And then she left. This is chapter 2 and verse 3, if you want to follow me. Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Just happened. I don't think it just happened. I think that it's another one of those cases I've been in the way the Lord led me. The thing that was hers to do at that point in time probably was go glean. And the Lord led her to the field of a man, again, by the name of Boaz. He was a man of great wealth, and he was a relative of Elimelech. And in the law, and we'll see more about it before we get through, but there were provisions that if something happened like happened in that situation, somebody had either a privilege or responsibility, however you want to look at it, to marry that person whose husband died and there was no children to the marriage yet. And so she happened to glean in Boaz's field, who was of the family of Elimelech. That was her father-in-law who had died. Now behold, Boaz came from the Bethlehem to see the reapers, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Now, I like to think about this from a standpoint of a young lady that's looking for a husband. Okay, you're out in the field, you've been reaping, probably following behind the reapers and scratching around in the dirt and dust of the field, probably since sunup. And it's probably close to midday. And the guy that's going to be your future husband shows up on the scene. And he says, who's that gal over there? But that's the way it was. And so Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after your reapers and among the sheaves. Now really, she didn't have to ask that way as far as I know. That was God's instruction to the owner of the land. You let them reap behind. And but he says she came and said, please let me read. Again, I take that as an indication of her character. Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. And then Boaz said to Ruth. So I think I'm correct. She's probably, if you pardon the words, not polite, but sweaty. She's probably dusty. She may be flushed from working harder than in the sun than she normally would, maybe has done. She may not either if she walked from Moab to Bethlehem, so she may have been pretty well tanned already. But so Boaz goes to talk to her. Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Again, I appreciate the way he addresses her. He said, hey, you, let me tell you something. No. He says, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go and glean in another field, nor go from here. And I think, I don't know this to be true, but I'm not aware that it's in his mind that he's a near kinsman to her at this point. I don't know any reason to believe that he does. She just took a woman. But stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? Why was that important or necessary? Because you remember what we started out with, what was going on during the time of the judges in Israel? The moral standard of some people in Israel at that time. And he probably had enough sense to know that there were people in that field that would take advantage of her if they thought they could get away with it. And so he's told them, hey, don't mess with the lady that came from Moab. And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men are drawing. If you get thirsty, just help yourself to the water that the guys have drawn for the rest of the crew. So she fell on her face and bowed down to the ground and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? Why would you, from her standpoint, she probably would be people would be prejudiced against her. She certainly wasn't, unless they knew otherwise, she wasn't a Jewess. And she hadn't proselyted to Judaism, as far as I know. So there were lots of issues that could have been in the mix. But she was a foreigner. And to me, it's really important for her, and it's part of the story. She has a good reputation already. And that's what Boaz knows. And Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and now you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. You've left your father, your mother, and you've come to the land of a people that you didn't know before. And really there's a sense that those of us who have accepted Jesus Christ and those who will accept Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, they're strangers and pilgrims. We really are. We don't fit. We don't belong. We should have a good reputation, all right. But as far as we're pilgrims and strangers in a foreign country. So it's been told that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father, your mother, the land of your birth, have come to a people whom you did not know. The Lord repay your work and fully reward by giving you, full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. See, that's the decision that she made that's really the most important decision in her life, just like it is in our life. When we come to the place that we commit our life to God, to do what pleases Him, to take refuge under His protection, even when, as we look in the world around us, that we recognize it is changing to some degree, but also we recognize it's deteriorating. It's not, we need a refuge. We need a refuge. And then she said, Ruth said, let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. You know, she expresses appreciation for his recognition of her and encouraging the harvesters to drop some sheaves for her, some grains for her, and let her to eat and drink with them, and telling the men in the field, don't mess with that gal. She appreciates that. But again, they go out to dinner together for the first time. All covered with dust from the field and perspiration from whatever exertion that's been going on. She goes out to dinner with her future husband. Not that she had any idea that's what she was doing, but again, anybody that was trying to figure out, I wonder how I can look the best I can for this guy, this wasn't it. So, in chapter 2 and verse 4, now Boaz said to her in mealtime, come here, and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So they were eating bread, they were dipping it in vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied. And then there's another little interesting thing there to me, and kept some back. Why? Why'd she keep it back? She wasn't just thinking about herself. In fact, she wasn't just out there in the first place for herself, but she kept some back. And when she rose up to glean, and Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And in verse 16, also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her, and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. So they're really going to sweeten the pot. They're going to make it easy. They're going to drop grain. They're going to let her get right in close to the bundles and pick up what's dropped. Well, probably, I would assume, if I picture it accurately, that, yeah, they drop some, but they can grab some of it and include it back in the bundles that they're pulling together. And they probably don't let the poor people come in until after they've moved the bundles off. Verse 17, so she gleaned at the field until evening and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And then she took it up and went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought it out and gave it to her, what she had kept back after she was satisfied. So she gave her mother-in-law the part of their lunch that she held back for her. And then Naomi begins to put things together again. She's beginning to think in a positive way. And her mother-in-law tells her in verse 19, where have you gleaned today? Because I would assume that her mother-in-law had some idea, if a woman goes out there, follows the people that are harvesting, the reapers, and gleans what they drop, gets what she can get out of the corners if she's getting some out of the corners, and brings it back, she knew about how much it was going to be, I would believe. And what Ruth brought back was way beyond what she would have thought was normal. And so she says, her mother-in-law said to her, where have you gleaned today, and where did you work? Blessed is the one who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law, of whom she had worked, and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. So then her mother recognizes, maybe we got something here. Then Naomi said in verse 20 to her daughter-in-law, blessed be the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness. That's a change of attitude to me on Naomi's part. Blessed be the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. She was the living, Ruth was the living, and Naomi's husband and Ruth's husband were the dead. He hasn't forgotten his kindness. No, Naomi, he never did. And I think it's important that we can remember that too. No, he never does. He never does. And Naomi said to her, Ruth, this man is a relative of ours, one of our close relatives. Ruth the Moabite said, he also said to me, you shall stay close to my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that people not meet you in another field. I don't know whether that had to do with the times that they lived in and what possibly could have happened. I don't know. So she stayed close, verse 23 says, close by the young men, Oh, and women of Boaz to glean until the end of barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. Now then, there is a provision, as I said earlier, and I'll just briefly refer to it, that if there were two brothers, one died, his wife had not had any children, then the next brother in line was to take that woman and marry her, and then the first child born would carry the deceased brother's name. And that way they would keep the families of Israel from dying out. And we find that a number of places. In Genesis 3:16, we have it in the situation Genesis 38:8, in the account of Judah and his children. And Onan was actually would have been the second brother that married this one. Third brother that married this one. And Judah tells him, go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. And then when we get to Leviticus chapter 25, we have another expression of how if someone in Israel became poor and they had to sell their birthright, you might say. If one of your brethren become poor and has sold some of his possessions, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, a redeeming relative, then he may redeem what his brother sold. And Boaz was in that lineage of a redeeming brother, and that will be mentioned when the deal is made for Boaz and Ruth to marry. In Deuteronomy 25, and if brothers dwell together, one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of the husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And that's in Leviticus 25:10, we also read of the year of Jubilee, when land that was sold, an inheritance or part of one's right of land was sold, then at the 50th year, it could be bought back. And if someone wanted to buy it back before the 50th year, as I understand it, they paid the value from whatever year it was, whatever year was remaining until the 50th year. And then, of course, in Matthew chapter 22, to try to trip up the Lord Jesus Christ, those who are trying to trip him up come to him and they say, Teacher, Moses said if a man dies having no children, that his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offspring to his brother. And this guy had, and it happened, I think, 5 times or 6 times. Whose wife is she going to be? You know, that's the trick question. So what is going to happen in the book of Ruth is what God intended to happen. And so, and I think I'll just follow on. Naomi gives Ruth some instruction. And to us, it would sound very risky, I think. But it worked. Naomi, chapter 3 and verse 1, tells her, My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? And I think it's interesting that Naomi, regardless of when she was feeling bitter instead of pleasant, she seemed to always have a concern. How can I help my widowed daughter-in-law find a husband, get married? And so she tells her, verse 2 of chapter 3, Now Boaz, whose young woman you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winning into barley tonight at the threshing floor. Okay, this man is a man that's in that that I just briefly alluded to, but in that lineage, that he has a right and a privilege, a responsibility to redeem the land, and to marry you, and to raise a seed to your first husband, to the first seed. And so she gives her some instruction. And I've often thought a lot of people would probably really choke at this, but she tells her, therefore wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. That's where they're working at night. And do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. And he will tell you what you should do. How many people would think that's a very good idea? But consistent with the times in which they lived, consistent with the confidence that Naomi had in Boaz and in Ruth. In essence, she basically was offering herself to him. In fact, that's what she tells him, really. Then she says, verse 4, then it shall be that when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies down, you shall go in, uncover his feet, lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. And she said to her, all that you say to me, I will do. Okay. The God under whose wings I've come to rescue, or to rest, or to find shelter, I hope he's directing you. I would think she would be thinking, this sounds a little scary. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law instructed her. And after Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Now it happened at midnight that the man was startled and turned himself, and there was a woman lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? And she answered, I'm Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. That was a not too subtle way of saying, I'm willing to be your wife. And Boaz could have taken unfair advantage of her. He could have been of a mindset similar to the people in the tribe of Benjamin, remember, who violated the concubine of the Levite. But that wasn't the kind of man he was. And the God under whose wings Ruth had come to trust is the one that designed the system. And it works. And then he said, Boaz said, blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning. That's an interesting thought. Okay, again, and it's really kind of practical, you know. Okay, here's a young woman. I assume she was an attractive woman. And Boaz is an older man. He's not, from his saying, he doesn't consider himself such a great catch. You've shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in that you did not go after young men, whether rich or poor. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request. In other words, in essence, she asked him to become her husband. And in the morning it shall be that if, excuse me, I just skipped. Now, it is true that I am a close relative. Let me back up. I jumped. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. She had a reputation already. Now, it is true that I am a close relative. In other words, I fit in that lineage. I could do as you're asking. However, there is a relative closer than I. Now we got a problem. Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good. Let him do it. And then I don't know whether she'd have been so willing to let this other relative take the place that she offered herself to Boaz for or not. They, as far as I know, she probably didn't even know who he was. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you. As the Lord lives, lie down in the morning. So she did. You know, Peter, in 1 Peter 3, speaks of the ornament of a gentle and quiet spirit. A quiet spirit is a spirit that's not anxious. It's not fretting. It's not frustrated. It's not, and in the context of Peter, it's talking about the adornment of a gentle and quiet spirit on the part of a woman who has a husband who doesn't obey the word of God, but to have a gentle and quiet spirit. But to me, if you were a young woman and you put yourself where Ruth is right now, I could see a lot of rooms for a lot of people, a lot of areas where a lot of people could be really frustrated or really anxious or, I wonder what's going to happen now. But she apparently wasn't that way. She lay down at his feet until morning. She rose before one could recognize each other. And he said, do not let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. He wants to protect her reputation still. And then he said, do not let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. Also he said, bring the shawl that you hold it. And she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. So when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, is that you, my daughter? I think that's a question of what happened? What's the deal? Are you still my daughter, or are you his wife? Then she told her all that it meant that the man had done, and she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave me, for he said to me, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And then her mother gave her some good advice. She said, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the day. Naomi must have been expecting that Ruth might be getting a little anxious, a little worried, a little wondering what's going on. But actually, for Ruth to be able to sit still was consistent with coming to rest under the wings of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So she wasn't asking her a whole lot, you know. Ruth had come because of a commitment to find shelter under the wings of the Lord God of Israel. Ruth did what her mother-in-law told her to do. Wash or lie down at his feet. And now she can trust God. She can let it go. I've done all I can do. I've done what I'm told is the thing that should be done at a time like this. You know, and it's like we're told in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him. In other words, let him direct what you do. And he will direct your path. And so to me, it's a beautiful thing that Ruth was able to do some things that you might, particularly if you were from a different culture, think are a little bit shaky. But she did them. And so now we switch over to Boaz in chapter 4. And true to what Naomi said, he won't rest until he gets the matter settled. He's going to get the job done. Okay, this is a privilege and a responsibility. He obviously treated Ruth with care. So he goes to the gate when people gather going in and out of the city, and that's where deals were made and broken and things were recorded. And he sits down until the guy that was the nearer kinsman walks by. And so when Boaz sees him, he says, hey, come here. And so Boaz said to him, come aside, friend, sit down here. So he came aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So you got 11 guys sitting in a circle, let's say, and they're gonna make it. The 2 of these guys, Boaz and the nearer kinsman to Ruth than he was, are going to agree, and it's going to be acknowledged by the city, the elders of the city, that they made a deal.
Wouldn't that be 12 men?
I beg your pardon?
Wouldn't that be 12 men in the circle? He took 10
10
men.
and 2 is 12? Yes, you're right. 10 and 2 is 12. So he tells him, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold a piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought, and again, as I said earlier, as part of the situation in Israel, you could buy it back. Just because I saw it really was a 50-year lease, almost what it amounted to. But you could buy it back, or at the end of Jubilee, 50 years, it went back. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know. For there's no one but you to redeem it, and I'm next to you. And he said, I'll redeem it. And Ruth wasn't a part of those negotiations, but if she had, I bet she would have been kind of anxious. I've talked to some young ladies whose husbands-to-be went and talked to their parents, and some of them really stressed as they knew the conversation was going on, and they didn't know which way it was going, and they were really anxious that the deal go through, but they thought maybe their father or their father and mother were not going to go along. But so if Ruth had been there, well, she would have thought, oh, I don't even know this guy, maybe. But that wasn't the end. So he said, the nearer kinsman said, I'll redeem the land. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field and from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. Now I don't understand that, but you redeem my right of redemption for yourself, or I cannot redeem it. I can't do it. And then the explanation is, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm anything. One man took off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was a confirmation in Israel. Therefore, the close relative said to Boaz, buy it yourself. So he took off his sandal. So then Boaz exercises his right. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witness this day that I have bought all that is Elimelech's and all that was Chilion and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. The name of the dead may not be cut off among his brethren from his position at the gate. You were witness this day. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witness. So that in essence, that's what we do when we have a wedding. If somebody gets a license and we have it's interesting in Peru, where I had the privilege just recently of doing a wedding away. The part that I do really has no legal value at all. But they do it all at the courthouse, the city courthouse. Here we get a license from the courthouse, and then I sign the license if I'm doing the wedding. But here, it was all done in front of 10 elders or in front of the people, and it was a binding deal, just as good as the one that we do. And so the people said, we're witnesses. And then they went on to say, the Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephratah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this woman. So it paid in this life for Ruth to take refuge under the wings of the Lord God of Israel. It paid. It always pays. I don't care what part of you are, where you are in the history of mankind. Godliness is profitable unto all things, not only for the life that now is, for the promise not only for the life that now is, but for the one that is to come. So as we end up the story, Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. the Lord gave her conception. She bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, apparently as she was, I don't know whether she was holding the son or not when they said it, but blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative. And may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him. And then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, this son born to Naomi, and they called him Obed. He's the father of Jesse. He's the father of King David. And then the genealogy to David. So, was it a prominent name? Yeah. Yeah. Did God bless her? Yeah. Did God in the story, is it established that, okay, there's the legitimate needs that men and women have for marriage, God intended that we live that way. That doesn't mean that we can't live some other way if we have to, but that's his basic intent. And so it's really kind of a practical thing. Now, if we're going to do it, we got to do it consistent with whatever the legality is with the particular people with whom we live. But it gets down to some basic relationship between two people, a commitment to each other under God, two people that meet the criteria that God has established, and then who conduct themselves in a way that God intends that they conduct themselves. And the sad part is that we live in a culture where people, we have, with the Airbnb, we have high percentage. Most of the people, 95% of them at least probably, are a couple. Are they married? If I can guess, I'd say maybe 50%. Maybe more, but that's my guess, because we don't ask them. And therefore we live in a culture where people, they don't stop to think that, wait a minute, there is a God. He established man, created man, and created woman, and established the relationship, established the fact that it would be a sexual relationship, established the fact that it would be a sexual relationship that is designed in such a way that people are going to be involved in that relationship, sexually, whether they're married or not. And so it's critical for those who want God's best in their life, and for those particularly that have accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, that we do it God's way. Ruth did it God's way, and it worked. To not do it God's way, it won't work as God intended it to work. Now, to say that two people that don't allow God to guide and direct, maybe in the beginning or the early part of their relationship, that they can't have a happy marriage. No, I'm not saying that. Does it mean that the sins that they commit in that point of time or that period, they can't be forgiven them? No, I'm not saying that. But I do believe, based on my experience in life and many, many hours of talking to people, that failure to be true to God's order in the early stages of that relationship tend to compromise the beauty that God expects and the trust and the comfort that God will allow to develop in that relationship when we do follow God's way. Godliness is profitable to all things, having the promise not only of the life that now is, but that which is to come. And I actually think in the interaction, most people today would think that's a terrible way to court in a field when the woman is gleaning barley and the guy is just checking on his health, But it's interesting to me that they even in that setting, they demonstrate a respect for each other. They demonstrate a consideration for each other. Boaz particularly demonstrated a concern for her reputation. They were conducting themselves as recorded, consistent with what the Scripture talks about when it talks about love in 1 Corinthians 13. what's in the best interest of the other person. She was not a feminist, and he was not macho in the way they treated each other. That is a godliness, and it really doesn't work, and I think it's pretty well proven in our society. I'll stop. Your thoughts?
I appreciate the fact that